Let me start by saying how really sorry I am not to be at this event to mark the 30th anniversary of the Development Studies Association of the UK and Ireland. Throughout my professional career, the DSA has been both a community and an anchor, rooted in its values, its internationalism, its commitment to evidence-based policy, its strong tradition of multidisciplinarity, and also its commitment to making change in the world, and how important those values are, particularly at this time when we see the financial crisis turning into a global recession. And you know, I've been thinking a lot about our experience of the 1980s and remembering the times when Richard Jolly, who by then was Deputy Executive Director of UNICEF, would go around seminars and workshops holding what I always remember as being slightly tattered copies of partial nutrition surveys carried out in African countries, demonstrating that structural adjustment as it rolled out across Africa was having very severe consequences for the poorest people. And we're going to face exactly that problem today, but this time we need to be ready not just with partial nutrition surveys, but with better evidence and a narrative on why it is that recession is affecting the poorest most severely and what needs to be done about it. We talked in the 1980s about adjustment with a human face. I'm thinking about recession with a human face and how we can make sure that the measures that are taken to counter the recession don't leave the poorest behind. That would be a project which would bring all the skills of the Development Studies Association to bear, and is one I think we should not neglect. In the longer term, though, what we know is that the recession will have a short-term impact, but that there will be an upswing and countries will recover. And as we think about that problem, we're going to see development studies changing in ways which we have only barely begun to grapple with. And certainly at ODI, as we think about the future of our institution as a think tank in this rapidly changing world, we think there are challenges ahead which will change the content of what we do and the way we work. But I suspect those challenges will be faced by all the institutions across the DSA family. We talk about the 3 C's at ODI. The 3 big challenges are 3 C's. The first is coverage, the second is capacities, and the third is communications. And I'd like to say just a word about each of those 3, coverage, capacities, and communications. The first issue is coverage. The discussion about the impact of the recession, which countries will be affected through what transmission mechanisms, which people within those countries, how do we respond, already tells us that the world is changing and that the frame that we need is a different one to the one we had in the past. There are 3 important ways in which the content of development studies is changing. The first is exactly this question of how we grapple with the new globalization. You know, when China entered the world economy, the labour to capital ratio in the world halved. No, didn't, it doubled. The labour to capital ratio in the world doubled. And that had a big impact on wages and on the manufacturing prospects of poor countries. We need a story which tells us something important about how countries can benefit from the new globalization, how the new globalization will be managed, and how national policies will reflect what is happening at global level. I was interested to discover the other day that the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944 was actually the economic wing of a larger United Nations project. It was known as the United Nations Conference. And at the same time, first in Dumbarton Oaks and then in San Francisco, the political wing of the UN was being established with the writing of the Charter, the creation of the structures, the Security Council, and so on. A lot of talk these days about Bretton Woods too. My view is we need a San Francisco too, because this issue about how we manage globalization is part of a much bigger conversation about how we structure global governance. So that first big issue about the new globalization is a challenge. The second is that we see increasing concentration on issues of fragile states and the interface between development, foreign policy, security, and that is going also to change the way in which we work. The Dutch minister, Bert Koenders, talks about the 3 Ds in Dutch development policy. Development, defence, and diplomacy, and how those fit together. big challenge for the DSA, and as I'll say in a few minutes, with the growth of middle-income countries, aid resources and maybe the development focus will increasingly be on a smaller number of conflict and post-conflict countries. Fragile states, the Somalias, the Southern Sudans, the Darfurs, the Congos, these are the future territory on which development studies will have to make its mark, a very different one for many of us to the one that we've been used to. The third big change in this area of coverage is the shift from discussing national policy to looking at regional and global public goods. What better case could there be of that than the financial stability discussion? But climate change is another very good example. Of course, peace and disarmament and security are also examples. Questions of how we manage global disease threats, global crime threats, drugs and terrorism, and so on. For the past 30 years, we've had a conversation in which national development policy has been the main focus of what we've done. Don't you think that in the future we're going to be looking much more at regional and global issues, and that will require different skills within our multidisciplinary family? Put those three together, and it seems to me that the work we do in development studies in the future will have to be very different to what we've done in the past. To be crude, I think we're going to need fewer people who understand the ethnography of tribal communities in remote parts of India, and more people who understand how to broker global deals in Geneva, New York and Washington. Different skills, different people perhaps, but doing different things. That's the first big challenge we face, the first C. What's the second C? The second C is about capacities. 30 years ago, when the DSA started, there were excellent centres of research and training in the UK, not nearly so many in the developing world. Well, in my part of our community, the think tank part, there are now 1,000 think tanks in the world working on international development, many of them in developing countries, and every day those think tanks grow stronger with better research capacity, better capacity to disseminate, more policy influence, better policy networks. We can no longer work in ODI, and I'm sure in many of our institutions, in ways which ignore that reality. We need new partnerships, new networks ourselves, but we also need to think every day, what is the comparative advantage of an institution based in the UK? Is it our comparative advantage to be carrying out field-based research in developing countries, or is it our comparative advantage to be working the corridors of power in the capitals of the North? And I observe, just as an illustration, that the Centre for Global Development in Washington, an institution we all respect and admire, has no work whatsoever in developing countries. Its entire focus is on development policy in the North. I don't think this applies in nearly the same way to universities and to teaching institutions who have a different mandate and different needs and different orientation. But for all of us, there is the challenge always of asking, what is it that we do that distinguishes us from what can be done in New Delhi or in Caracas or in Maseru? And that will, I think, increasingly shape a different kind of institution in the UK. The third C that I want to say something about is communications. Because sitting in London and working in a think tank and not a research institute as I do, what I observe is that the news cycle and the speed of communication is changing almost everything that we do. In the course of our last strategic review in 2007, we looked at the pattern of our outputs over the past decade. And to put it in the most simple terms, we used to write books and now we write blogs. We've become shorter, we've become simpler in some senses, we've certainly become much faster. And why have we done that? Because the news cycle moves day by day, but also because we know that policymakers need to have responses to problems quickly, and they need to be able to be given options which they can act on, often overnight, certainly in a very short time frame. You can't any longer, maybe you never could, I'm sure you never could, as a researcher, say to ministers when they ring up, interesting question, minister, give me 6 months and a research grant and I'll give you the answer. Ministers are making decisions, they need answers quickly, we need to provide them. And I've been enormously impressed working in ODI by the way in which our quick communications are able to reach an audience and influence policy. And of course, we're doing our public meetings, we're writing our blogs, we're doing our opinion pieces and our briefing papers, and those reach a very large audience very quickly. That doesn't mean, it really doesn't mean that we ignore research. ODI is always research-based, and we are proud to publish 2 fully refereed academic journals, and we also, of course, write books. Someone like Paul Collier, enormous influence with the bottom billion. Books do still matter, but we need a range of outputs, and we mustn't ignore this new way of communicating. ODI has a Facebook page. We are on Wikipedia. We use YouTube. We try to make sure that we're using as many of these new forms of communication as we possibly can, and in the future that is going to change the way we work. Put those 3 together, coverage, capacities and communications. Think through the consequences in a globalizing and urbanizing world, and you know what, we're going to be different in 10 years time than we are today, different in 5 years time than we are today. We're going to have different skills, different disciplines, working together in new ways on different problems with new kinds of partnerships, and communicating in new ways. And the challenge for all of us who manage these institutions, the challenge for those of us in a community like the DSA, and the challenge for the DSA itself representing the industry, the sector representing the institutions in development, is to make sure that we stay ahead of this conversation and shape our institutions. And the management challenge we face, I think, is to make sure that we respond to this new environment. Let me end with one final thought, which is something that's been on my mind a lot, which is the rapid growth in the number of middle-income countries and what that means for the future of development studies. Because certainly for me as an individual, for all of us who work in ODI, and I'm sure for all of you in the DSA, we're interested in the intellectual issues that arise in studying development, but we're also very concerned with the practical application of ideas, with the praxis of development policy. And we've been able, over the generation since the Second World War, if you like, to find ourselves working in countries which have high levels of poverty and where development is a project in which the North is very heavily engaged. Now, many of those countries are now becoming middle-income countries. 1st of September this year, India became a middle-income country. The World Bank tells us that by 2015, the number of low-income countries that are eligible for IDA money is going to fall by at least a quarter, perhaps as much as a third. And the number of people in countries eligible for IDA money, because some countries are very large, is going to fall by almost half, from something over 2 billion, I think, to something around 1 billion. If you take our development customers, if you like, as being the people in low-income countries, well, lo and behold, most of them will no longer be in the shopping mall available for us to work with. And there will be some big decisions facing DFID about how quickly it disengages from those countries. It's already planning to move out of China, of course. How long will it be before we close the aid program in India? Will it be 2 years? Will it be 5 years? Will it be 7 years? I'm sure it won't be much longer than that. And there will be many other countries moving in a similar direction, to the extent that we are left with this small group, as I said earlier, of fragile states, conflict and post-conflict countries, which will become the new focus of the development practitioners. Does that imply changes for us working in international development? Well, certainly it does. Whether we are researchers or trainers and or policy entrepreneurs, as we try to be in ODI. And that's a real challenge, don't you think, that we have to find a way of focusing our profession. Say you're running a research and teaching institution which is interested in the problems of poverty in the world. Well, I think it would be entirely justifiable to continue working in China and India. But there will come a point where working on poverty studies in those countries is not dissimilar to working on poverty studies in Italy, in Germany, in Portugal. It becomes just another branch of the interesting things we do in countries which are not that dissimilar to us. So there's the challenge for development studies in the future. When does development studies become a little bit like Portuguese studies and a little bit less like an extension of the policy department of Oxfam or the World Development Movement? We're not there yet, but look ahead far enough and I'm sure we will be. As we make these big changes in our profession, as we think about the coverage, the capacities, the communications of our partners, as we think about how we have to evolve in response to the changing needs in the world, as we think about how we respond to the current recession, it is essential that we retain those values which have driven DSA since its inception 30 years ago. The internationalism, the multidisciplinarity, the belief in evidence-based policy, the commitment to action. I'm proud to be a member of an association which hold those values. I think those values provide us with the template and the guidance we need for the future. I look forward to coming to the next celebration of the DSA's 60th anniversary and to celebrating at that time the way in which it's changed and it continues to be relevant. I wish the DSA all future success. Thank you.